Welcome to the story of Payday 3, the start of a brand new narrative I'm looking forward to bringing to YouTube. This isn't my usual intro because I want to make a few disclaimers first. Payday 3's story is still very much in the process of being told. Right now, as of launch, there are plenty of characters we know very little about, such as the vendors or even the primary antagonists, so this episode is written without any hindsight. In the future, more might come to light that changes the information I'm relaying, at which point I will look into updating this video, but I still think there's value in sharing the story as I see it right now. Also, Payday 2 made visual storytelling much easier due to the existence of mods, such as the free flight camera. Payday 3 lacks these tools at the moment, so I apologise if the visuals I use to convey the narrative don't hold up to my usual standard. Again, if I get retroactive access to similar tools, I will update everything. That said, the story of Payday 2 launched my range of Apex gaming PCs, and to celebrate their success over the last couple of years, and to give a little back to you guys for supporting, they're running a giveaway on this episode in the form of a $250 Apex Gaming PCs gift card. All you need to do to be in with a chance of winning is follow them over on Twitter, or X if you go for that rebranding, link down in the description, and leave a comment below with the word "law" somewhere in the sentence, just like I have in the pinned comment. Check out the range of PCs also linked below, and I will be picking a winner at random on the 20th of November. That out the way, let's get into the story you know and love. 5 years of peace. Peace for Dallas and his gang, peace for DC, peace for America. But human nature seems to reject peace at all costs. Some wrestle with the emptiness of it, with time to think about nothing but the demons of their past, whether they want to or not. Others refuse to forget. The allure of revenge tastes sweeter than whatever those years of peace were ever worth. The Payday gang, as they were known at their peak notoriety in 2018, had each gone their own way in those years of anonymity. They'd retired, in every official capacity pronounced dead and disbanded, but unofficially pardoned of their many crimes, to live lives of luxury in complete freedom. And that was until the ghosts of their past lives and crimes came back to haunt them in September 2023. Within the span of 24 hours, the entire crew, including close associates like their old handler Locke, were taken off the grid by simultaneous global assassination attempts, unable to be reached, presumed missing, or worse, truly dead. But the Payday gang don't disappear overnight, not at the hands of faceless, unknown assailants. Dallas, Hoxton, Chains, Wolf, and Locke's own protege Joy were all alive, together, back in New York, the place where it all began. This is the story of Payday 3. Let's get you back in the saddle, shall we? The Payday gang was back, reformed under a new handler, Shade, who'd moved ahead of the assassins to contact each member of the gang to inform them of the impending danger. She was an old associate of Bane's from back before his guitar obsession enraptured everything he did. After presumably losing the 2020 election to none other than Robert McKendrick, the 47th President of the United States, his location and status was unknown, meaning all the gang remnants who'd made it out could do was hear out Shade and her plans to rebuild CrimeNet from the ashes. This was going to be an uphill battle. With only 5 active gang members and their bank accounts preemptively frozen, it was clear that whoever had rallied their would-be killers knew that contingencies needed to be in place to hold back the tide of inevitable repercussions. Whoever the culprit was, they knew the gang all too well, as within days, Shade was already finalising the details in a small-time high street hold-up on a Manhattan branch bank. Outside of their core group, they still had a few old associates, and Shade's connections to rely upon. Gage had never left the arms business, and having benefited tremendously from their DC spree, remained at hand to offer all the firepower Shade might request. They also brokered black market deals with Gleam, a mask maker, to upkeep their now old and war-torn disguises, as well as one Mr. Wright, a tailor who could augment their clothing with ballistic nylon set into the material. This was all the preparation the gang could muster for this first job back, as it was incredibly time-sensitive. Shade had intel on a secure Capital Branch bank in Bowery, which was housing an unusually large sum of cash awaiting distribution around the region. Whilst it looked like a honeypot given the size of the potential take and serious security presence in the area, No one knew the Payday gang was back, at least not yet. New York had grown fat and lazy in their absence, making this the perfect mark to announce their return. The secure capital branding was all too tempting to make a mockery of for the gang as they headed in silently, ready to spark off a chain reaction that would start it all over again, that life of crime they'd escaped so fleetingly. In for a penny, in for a pound, they were joined by two more stalwart allies, as none other than Twitch, the expert escape driver, dropped them off, and Bile, the helicopter pilot, waited in the wings for when things went loud. And of course, they had to. Sneaking this heist proved nothing, to themselves or the rest of the world. Facing down the NYPD was the only way to announce their return properly, and ironically, made further assassination attempts harder to pull off, so intense would be the media outrage around their reappearance, and attention that would draw towards those opposing them from the shadows. The Payday gang lives and dies by their notoriety, when infamy isn't won from a silent crime. The core four massed up in the foyer, ghosts of the past, instructed by Shade and equipped with some of Joy's technological handiwork. Within minutes, the bank was under their control, and Bile was airborne to drop off their primary tool on this heist, thermite, which could be used to burn their way into the vault through the floor above. Over the years, police procedure had changed. After the body count of the Payday gang's first spree, civilian lives were now priorities above all else, and the crew were more than aware of this change in policy. Now, so long as they kept feeding the cops a steady wave of human lives, including those of the security guards who were just as quick to surrender, they would delay their first assault. This gave the gang the time they needed to rifle through the bank's client files, as somewhere inside lay key intel Shade had been seeking out for a future job. They also started to prepare the pyrotechnic reaction on the bank's second floor. As the hot metal powder went to work, Bile made multiple passes to drop additional fuel for the fire, dropping the bags under a hail of fire from NYPD's SWAT responders. In the years between the events at the White House and this SCB heist, Commissioner Garrett's task force units had worked their way into most regional crime-fighting regimes. New York had reinforced their response to armed robbery with the addition of grenadiers, who could smoke gangs out of vaults, hostage rescue specialists, tasked with safely removing key resources from the criminals' grasp, and sabotage squads sent in to disrupt and slow the progress of any suspects, so that the old guard of the mighty bulldozers, tricky tasers, and sadistic cloakers could apprehend them all for good. But these crime responders were a pale imitation of the DC and murky water specialists the Payday gang had faced in the past, going soft in the absence of real, hardened heisters. Their equipment was inherently flawed, and the gang took no time at all getting to grips with and taking full advantage of their limitations. Shield units had requested a glass visor, meaning dead-eye marksmen like Hoxton could easily slip a shot through. Tasers, who'd strangely taken to calling themselves zappers now, wore their charge packs externally, meaning they were a ticking time bomb for their allies. Same with grenadiers, who were just asking to cause a chain reaction with their externally worn bandoliers. Cloakers couldn't handle bright lights thanks to their goggles, meaning their sight was badly damaged by any flashbangs that happened to go off nearby, and dozers could resist small arms fire all day, but lacked any real protection against armor-piercing rounds. However, one member of the responding force had the presence of mind to be rightly afraid, once the intel leaked that the Payday gang had returned. Agent Rebecca Stone, an officer who had been obsessed with the gang during their second spree, and was one of the few members on the force intimately aware of the details of the case. She spearheaded the FBI's role in attempting to prevent this heist, providing key intel to her men in the field and rallying more special units to hunt them down. With so few gang members and so many active threats, Bile was also having to pull his weight a bit more, carrying additional heavy weaponry which could be dropped at the ground crew's signal when in need of a little more firepower. This was overwhelming for the NYPD, who were forced back out of the bank as the gang finally opened up a hole in the roof of the vault, entering to quickly deactivate the die packs designed to stop would-be thieves in their tracks. Earlier in the heist, they'd found the account Shade was looking for tied to a Wixia executive, a major tech firm in possession of the kind of loot always worth stealing. He held a safety deposit box within the bank, and inside was confidential information regarding the production of new quantum computing parts. Intel for the future. As for this first, comparatively small-time heist, with their loot in tow, the gang pushed out from the bank once more, heading over to the main road to create space for their escape. Electronic blockades had been raised in response to the alarm, but with their power sources being so accessible, it was simple enough to jury-rig them back into the tarmac and open up a route for Twitch to roll through, picking up the gang for their first successful heist in over 5 years. several bags of cash richer, and with a decent lead on more work, it wasn't exactly gold coffers from another era, but it was the first step towards solidifying the Payday gang as a force to be reckoned with once again. However, with offshore accounts off the table after a change in bank transparency legislation, the gang was forced to make use of a new criminal invention, C-Stacks, an encrypted black market currency that wasn't foolproof but still held value within what remained of CrimeNet, meaning this was how they could clean the stolen funds. The second step towards placing the Payday gang back on the map and potentially discerning the identities of their new underworld adversaries was finding more supporters for the cause. And within a day, back at the safe house with Shade, she unveiled a new generation of Payday gang member, Pearl, a New York native who'd previously ran a crew in the Bronx, familiar with the area and the gang's prior work. The gang was also aware of her, following her escapades from afar in their absence, as Chains recounted her involvement in a $10 million hustle that had rocked the old Harvest and Trustee Bank more than even they ever had. Pearl was, like Joy, a criminal cut from a slightly different cloth, whose looks, personality, and build was best suited to act as an infiltrator or con artist. She was a perfect fit, given the loss of Bane and Locke and the newfound importance of guile and negotiations, and rest assured, she could handle herself in a gunfight just as well. But it was actually Joy who had the newest lead in the job to fund this next spree. Back in 2018, through an old friend of hers, she and the City of Gold crew had formed a lasting relationship with the San Francisco Triads, helping to dispose of their old leader in favour of this new contact, Xiaoyu. She was more than happy to return the favour even 5 years on, cutting the Payday gang into their plans for a heist stage outside of the Golden Gate City. This proposed job was surprisingly simple, reminiscent of the work the gang had done some 10 years prior. They'd be hitting a modernised GenSec armoured transport convoy that was taking a detour across the under-renovation Queensboro Bridge thanks to one of Shade's decoys that could also shake off its SWAT escort. Dropped in on the west side of the bridge, the gang had to first clear a path for the transport to follow, tying up the road workers and getting their hands on the pre-placed EMP and a remote steering device. With the modern era of electric vehicles taking over the armoured transport industry, they'd opened up a new avenue for the Payday gang to exploit, frying the electric motor and allowing them to take over the controls of the van with the steering device. The driver, as was the new policy, was just along for the ride, but SWAT teams were already onto where the real heist was going down, heeding his instant distress call. Fighting along the bridge, the crew had to stay in range of the vehicle to maintain their connection and keep it moving, making this an unpredictable and cramped gunfight, with SWATs abseiling over the side of the bridge. Their preparation here was key, allowing the van to proceed forward uninterrupted whilst under a hail of live rounds, with snipers setting up in the smokestacks to make life even more difficult for the gang. After shepherding the transport for 200 meters, they finally reached the ramp platform, mounting the van on top to grant access to the new weakness of these vehicles now their doors were so heavily reinforced, their electrics. Pulling out Wolf's favourite tool from way back in the day, they drilled through the first metal plate on its undercarriage, peeling open the protector and ripping out the wiring, in turn releasing the lock on the van and granting access to the deposit boxes within. The loot they were seeking was an unspecified precious metal, likely neodymium, a rare earth element commonly used in the production of electronics for e-cars and smartphones. A $1 trillion industry that Shai was now dipping her toes into, with a buyer already apparently identified, presumably back in the Triad's homeland. Whilst under heavy SWAT fire, the crew bagged the precious loot and lit a flare on the bridge, calling Bile in for pickup from the scaffolding that offered just enough cover for the crew to move the loot and protect their backs simultaneously. With the heavy materials in the back of Bile's chopper, the gang were forced to sprint their way back down the road whilst more waves of cops attempted to apprehend them, cutting into another under-repair section of the bridge to scale the stairs and zipline their way down to terra firma once more, escaping Queens and meeting back up with the remnants at the safe house. By now, the world was starting to wake up to the return of the Payday gang, but even after 2 incredibly well-paying hits, they were no closer to discovering who was responsible for the wider gang's recent downfall. But over 7 years of successful heists had given the crew enough of a reputation and enough friends to keep the work coming. One figure who'd remained in the criminal business even after her substantial payout in payment for suffering at the hands of Bane and Locke's anonymity plan in Alaska was the Butcher. Her ties to the gang had firmly planted her operations outside of the Balkans, and despite the seeds of mistrust, she'd remained in contact with Dallas over the years, and was more than happy to throw them a bone now they were back from retirement. Ashton Fine Jewelry Store, located in Sutton Place, just meters away from their last heist. This might have looked like a classy family jewelers from the outside, but was in fact operated by International Diamond Enterprises, a company known to procure gemstones from many of the most war-torn and conflicted areas in the world, with little regard for how they compensated their rightful owners. In other words, they dealt in blood diamonds, and had the kind of funds to utilize experimental subsurface laser etching techniques to mark these stones in such a way that the naked eye couldn't detect, revolutionizing their security. These etchings could never be polished out of existence economically, meaning they were effectively worthless to potential thieves. However, IDE was also flippant, after years without a robbery, and had only bothered to mark a small percentage of their diamonds as a deterrent. With the right planning, the gang could easily save millions in specialist fees by sorting these stones on the heist. With that in mind, Twitch dropped off the Core 4 on 57th Street, with silent infiltration being the working plan. Despite its size, this store had multiple layers of security that need to be bypassed. Sneaking in through the side door, they started by hacking the manager's computer for information on how they could access the VIP area filled with the premium goods. Many of these wealthier businesses were moving from traditional lock and key to digital locks, requiring QR codes to open each door. After getting through another of these modern doors, they noticed that the VIP jewels were locked behind alarmed cases. This forced the crew downstairs, where once again the world's lax approach to security in the absence of true criminals could be abused, finding a key code left out in the open and forcing their way into the basement. Here they took down the cameras and located the power supply, but not before coming across a safe with incriminating evidence of the nature of their blood diamonds inside. IDE and their working leadership were more than susceptible to blackmail, given the front Ashton Fine put on, enabling Shade to phone the manager, Riley Larson, with news of this revelation to force her back into the office, where the crew was already waiting, first using her obedience to access the centerpiece diamond from a secondary vault, and then to scan her iris on the entrance of the diamond workshop. Inside was a multi-tag scanner, which could sort the marked items rapidly, allowing them to effectively clean the jewelry and leave behind the subsurface marked pieces, saving millions in specialist fees once the loot was back at the safe house. With a dozen bags of jewelry pilfered, the crew hastily returned to the van which had driven around to the back alley behind the store, resulting in the first ever silent heist of the modern era. But, with the manager left alive to tell the tale, the Payday gang's reputation and mystique simply continued to grow once again, much to the frustration of the easily embarrassed Gensek, and much to the delight of none other than Vladislav Kozak. Despite his lasting ties to the gang, he wasn't a target of the attempted assassinations, but was seemingly furious that someone had the gall to try in the first place. He'd sought out the remnants in New York to witness their return with his own eyes. Whether his rage at their treatment was performative or not, it was always impossible to tell with Vlad, but what they could count on him for was work. Despite no longer personally partaking in organised crime, his ties to the criminal entertainment industry still ran deep, meaning he had a tip-off regarding the operations of the Neon Cradle nightclub at Pier 17 next to the Brooklyn Bridge, one of the most exclusive clubs in town. Upstairs it was business as usual, an establishment that made money from overpriced booze and expensive guest list memberships. But, using the building's unique location, built over the tracks of a disused subway line, the Cradle's owners had also created a high-class clubbing experience that accommodated illegal gambling and even more illegal substances, well guarded to those without VIP entrance. The objective was to get in there without arousing any suspicion, as, moving with the times, management had also started converting most of their nightly revenue directly into cryptocurrency, cleaning their funds instantly and storing them within a physical ledger held somewhere downstairs. The only way they'd be able to access the stored funds was if they got to them unnoticed, so the crew donned their best clubbing attire and headed inside. Around the rear of the nightclub, behind the DJ booth, they located Cassandra Rifkin's office, the nightclub manager who possessed blank VIP passes, ready for authorization. All they had to do was hack Rifkin's own phone for a passcode to access them, and then locate a scanning machine to validate their identities, giving them all the sway they needed with the bouncers on the basement door. Downstairs was the real club, but it was also seen as the safest location on the premises to its owners, housing the crypto wallet and an additional vault packed with cold hard cash to cover the establishment from any crypto market volatility. The security on these systems was about as lax as it comes, bearing in mind few VIP clients would risk a heist on the ownership. But the Payday gang was a different breed, and the Cradle wouldn't have the luxury of any insurance soon enough. They started by pulling the power on the wallet's storage to access it immediately, bypassing another retina scan via a PC override. Then they rifled through the accounts office to discover the lazily stored passcode for the secondary vault, blending in with the sort of confidence that allowed them to simply throw the bags of cash into the disused sections of the subway tunnels, for Vlad's insiders to pick up at the end of the night. With enough loot secured, all they had to do was head back up to the service elevator, pulling them out of the club completely unnoticed. The Cradle crew preferred something a little more low-key to celebrate, a trip to Hungry Bob's for Chains, Hawks, Dallas and Pearl, as she recounted a previous betrayal her gang had suffered, leaving her on her own. Meanwhile, Wolf and Joy remained with Shade, working towards finding the identities of the conspirators that had placed them in this compromised situation in the first place. Shade's contacts had finally had a breakthrough, discovering that the men and women they were after were located nearby, somewhere within New York, but had connections leading all the way up to President McKendrick, a man the gang were all too familiar with for his underhand political tactics. With nothing more to go off for the time being, she kept the gang busy by introducing them to an old friend of hers, Beckett, another New Yorker with all the connections the crew might need. This time around, his lead was on the Surface Art Gallery, which was hosting an exclusive exhibition using artwork on loan from some of the city's wealthiest private collectors. Beckett already had a buyer lined up. All the gang needed to do was head in and steal the artwork. Down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, better known to the natives as Dumbo, was home to remnants of Brooklyn's old warehouse buildings and cobblestone streets, a perfect location for a pretentious art gallery to appeal to wealthy young liberals. Surface was a fitting name for the location, as the art housed within was supposedly the product of tortured souls, yet this was only surface level deep when flanked by modern AI creations that appeared more incestuous than they were profound. Shade had a deep-seated hatred for all this artistic pretense, and was more than happy to see a few legitimate works of art that actually carried value shipped off to the highest bidder. Being a public space, the crew staged this heist late at night, but not late enough that a few candidate hostages wouldn't be on hand should the need arise. But that was Plan B. Plan A involved silently scaling the side of the building to access the upper floors, taking down the cameras, and proceeding with a Wi-Fi hack that allowed Shade to manually lower the bars, protecting the artwork from theft. Once the internal security lockdown was breached, they still had to duck and weave around motion-sensing traps straight out of an early 2000s spy flick. Clearly, Surface's owner had a sense of humour or an eye for theatrics, as these sorts of systems are all flash and no substance, allowing the crew to easily deactivate the anti-theft measures and get to work lifting the most valuable art in the building. They started with the only known painting location, Shooting Gallery Redux by Greg Judd, found within Exhibit A1, before heading back upstairs to locate the manager's office, where his desktop held information on the locations of the other marks. The crux here was that each exhibit was filled with authentic works, as well as forgeries. But such was the nature of these modern artists, it was virtually impossible even for their most dedicated followers to tell the pieces apart, so the Payday gang didn't have a chance without a little assistance. Pedro Vicario's pieces of work, if you could call them that, given that they were made famous by his attempted suicide in creating them, were easy enough. The crew just had to discern the clean ones from those covered in his blood by shining a UV light across them all. The poetry of it all was slightly wasted on the gang, although they were relieved things were still quiet, as it might have been difficult to separate his dried blood from any produced in copious volumes by the usual assault teams they faced down. Slightly more complicated were the Uma Ledet paintings. The Fiji mermaid was unique in that there were 2 copies on show at the gallery, but only one was the original, and the differences were so minimal that only a spectrophotometer could detect the chemical composition of the work to ascertain their authenticity. Fortunately, the museum had to keep one on the premises for whenever they returned the art to its owner, meaning it was possible for the gang to silently perform their own artistic appraisal, inserting a USB found within the manager's safe to bypass its self-destruct protocol and release the authentic painting from its mount, finally having taken enough art to head for the exit. They sent the pieces via zipline above the crowds of civilians, far too preoccupied with their view of the Brooklyn Bridge to notice the grand larceny taking place in their classy little neighbourhood. Heading over to the pre-parked escape van to load up the loot and flee the scene via the subway at a much more leisurely pace than usual. Back at the safe house, Shade had been busy. By reviewing the data trail on the gang's frozen bank accounts, she'd managed to trace all the nefarious actions back to one Patricia J. Shark, banker by blood, and as Hawk says, wanker by nature. She was also a major Gensec shareholder with enough reasons to hate the gang for their impact on her industry and finances. Killing her wasn't the next step though. Destroying her reputation was far more valuable to the gang in the long run, and could lead them to any potential co-conspirators, as it was unlikely even with Shark's connections she could have pulled this off alone. So the best way the Payday gang knew how to get revenge was always to rob a bank, but that wasn't the only reason for heading into Golden Shark Incorporated this time. They were also on the lookout for a server containing any details regarding the conspiracy, as hacking the bank's systems had yielded nothing, meaning she'd likely moved the details offline, presumably storing it in the safest place she was aware of, the vault of her flagship bank. Arriving at the garment district, in the shadow of a building lined with Corinthian columns, this was a financial institution almost on the same scale as DC's Benevolent, a centerpiece of the capitalistic banking system that underpins so much of American society. Bain would have been proud as the core four sidled their way into Golden Shark's spacious front office, refusing to miss out on their opportunity to leave a tangible mark on its storied history, masking up and immediately moving to crowd control the entire ground floor. A bank official with the credentials to open up the second floor gate was easy prey, found hiding from the gunfire in his office. This progressed the four onto yet another of Shade's famous Wi-Fi hacks, required to override the keypad to gain access to the vault. Now under heavy fire from the first responders, standing in precise locations looking for decent signal like they were on some sort of rural holiday wasn't any of the gang's idea of a good time, but they were more than up to the task. Moving through the heavy doors into a location that made a bit more sense to them, a drill and a vault really are a match made in heaven for the Payday crew, with Bile obliging by dropping off the new thermal lamps for setup within the ornate vault room. Within a couple of minutes and a few tanks of oxygen, the vault was prized wide open, with hundreds and thousands in liquid funds there for the taking. This wasn't the real prize though, as inside the metal cages were cabinets for offline server storage, and contained within them was the key puzzle piece that they were missing. Grabbing the server, the four hauled as much loot as they could carry up to the rooftop, funneling the pursuing SWAT into a death trap before calling in Bile with a flair for yet another sky-high rescue, a favourite technique of their old mentor. This was by far the most publicised heist of their return, and those old enough to remember the infamous First World Bank heist were given no doubt as to the legitimacy of the press's claims. The Payday gang were back. Unfortunately, the Golden Shark server wasn't the open book Joy was hoping for, spending most of the next few days trying to break her way through its encryption. But as Shade noted, the cutting-edge quantum-grade level of this tech was in itself a lead. Whoever was in bed with Shark would surely also have connections to that technology, meaning they just needed to follow the trail. And it just so happened that they were already on the right path. Shade's digging into the details of the Wixia contracts initially found in the SCB vault was exactly the sort of lead they were looking for. Now they just needed a specialist to track down the tech in transit. That specialist was Mac, a New Jersey crime boss with enough eyes around the city to know exactly what it was the gang were after. This Wixia tech was currently on the move, stationed temporarily in haulage containers at Jersey Port. According to him, the suit behind the deal shipping the tech into the city was none other than Ralph Garnett, all grown up. Ralph's family business, the Garnett Group, had been repeatedly a target of the Payday gang in the past. Hell, he'd even found himself in their custody once upon a time. But it was the diamonds they stole that had the longest lasting impact on him, as their theft had been enough to drive his father, Nathan Garnett, to end it all after the business went insolvent on his watch. It seemed Ralph was now conspiring with Shark, and who knows how many others, to end the Payday gang for all they'd done to his family. But in the process, he'd left himself wide open. The technology he was buying from Wixia to ensure his plans with Shark remain hidden was immensely expensive. In taking it, the crew would not only be able to reverse engineer the hardware to start decrypting the files, they'd also drive a wedge between Ralph and the Wixia Corporation, an expensive relationship well worth damaging. As such, after being briefed by Mac on the likely locations of the high-security cooling containers, under the cover of night, they made their entrance into the Roger Wilson Transport Warehousing Complex. The darkness made entrance much easier than it would have been otherwise, but did make the crew conspicuous once spotted, sending them spiraling into a skirmish with GenSec agents on site. With police responders soon on their way, the gang was quick to set up a tank of liquid nitrogen within the cold storage wagon ready for exfil. They then began their search for the experimental electronics by sifting through the files on the office computers. This gave them access to the storage coordinates of the freight containers that incubated the tech within specialized cooling units, calling Bile to once again drop thermite to burn their way through the external digital logs. Once inside, another Wi-Fi hack was required to enable Shade to throw off its geo-coded log system, with the older members of the crew bemoaning the simpler days of drills and saws. Even so, they were experts at signal catching for Shade at this point, allowing her to force open the final bulletproof door and at last grant access to the payload. Given that the components were extremely sensitive to changes in atmospheric temperature, they were forced to rush these almost alien-looking devices across the courtyard to avoid them going inert and depreciating in value. After repeating the process once more, escape was now their top priority. setting up a spike strip in front of the high-speed responders to prevent a chase they weren't prepared for in the Wixia Semi with millions of dollars worth of tech trailing behind them. The true nature of the quantum components they stole was never actually fully explained by Joy. Within a day, months worth of work on the server was complete. Wolf had his own crackpot theory, as they sold the extra components they didn't need personally through max contact, but Shade was quick to reassure him that the value was all that mattered in this transaction, and Mac could be trusted moving forward. The value of the heist was even greater than first anticipated though, as the Wixia deal fell through after their goods were taken without receiving payment, meaning Ralph was being dragged through the media cycle with a lawsuit ranging in the billions building against his name. Sadly for the gang, even with the Wixia tech, they still didn't have enough for Joy to get to the data within. An encryption key was necessary. But all wasn't lost. Joy was intimately familiar with the old Murky Water encryption design after her time learning under lock, and what she was facing down now appeared extremely familiar. Whilst Murky Water had collapsed under its own weight with the fall of Kento and the Dentist, disbanding without leadership, that didn't mean ex-Mercs couldn't still be around with more than enough reason to despise the Payday gang. They just needed a name. And it just so happened that there was another man greatly indebted to the Payday gang for favours out in the Old West. Blaine Keegan, an oil baron with a monopoly on the region, after an offshoot of the gang took down his only competition in Sarah. Whilst the old Texas team was no more, Keegan owed a favour in their name, and despite going on the straight and narrow in recent years, he still wound up meeting many interesting people in his line of work. One he traced all the way back to the old Murky Water Company, Mason Laurent, an ex-military man who spent time with the PMC when everything went to hell. Mason was now into cybersecurity, hence why he was trying to peddle his software to Keegan a few years ago. Amongst the tech he developed was a proprietary encryption system, likely lifted straight from his old employers when they went under. Whilst Keegan didn't bite on the tech, he still knew the details and could see how it matched up with what the gang was looking for, tipping them off to his penthouse suite in the upmarket Hunters Point region. The full extent of the conspiracy against them was finally starting to come together. Ralph Garnett held a grudge against the gang for what they'd done to his family, and still had his father's connections and family sway to organise retribution. His close associate Patricia Shark was also out for blood, and had the funds to invest in the operatives they'd need to discreetly take down the retired crew. Mason Laurent, the ex-Merc, joined the conspiracy as an opportunist who also had it out for his old nemesis. As insurance, Sharp pulled the strings with her banking associates to freeze any accounts tied to the gang, disabling them even if they did survive the attempts on their lives. But unsurprisingly, even this wasn't enough. In their panic, upon hearing of the gang's re-emergence, the three began to cover their tracks. Ralph used what remained of his inheritance to fund a deal with Wixia, the tech giant who had the means to protect the details of their plans within an uncrackable server. Laurent stepped in to encrypt their data so that even if the Wixia server could be recovered, their illegal actions would be protected from ever leaking publicly, retaining their reputations. Unfortunately for them, all of this proved to be insufficient against the unstoppable force that is the Payday gang, and now they were knocking at Mason's door to crack everything wide open. His apartment building was tightly guarded as the paranoia had set in. There was security on the front door and a stand-in camera operator 24 hours a day. But that wasn't enough of a deterrent, sneaking into the suite via a ventilation shaft and catching Mason in the middle of entertaining a few of his confidants, which was ideal. He was overheard warning that heads would roll as the gang drew closer, which was prophetic as the crew set about unlocking the door to his bedroom, finding his hidden vault behind a classic hidden bookcase switch, and hacking access to the utility room from the lead guard. This allowed them to access the spare RFID tag that opened the office. Requiring a keycode to proceed, they wrapped back around overhearing Laurent stepping out for a call, except he wasn't talking to Shark or Garnet. This was someone else he was confiding in, begging for another strike on the gang's lives. They brushed this off, assuming he was on the phone to another hitman, the likes of which wouldn't have a chance against them now they were back together as a crew. Instead, they saw this as an opportunity, grabbing a vial of something poisonous within the storage cabinet and slipping it into a bottle of Rivertown Glen whiskey that had just been delivered for a toast. In a single swig, Mason was rushing to the bathroom and directly into the arms of Wolf, who wrapped his forearm around his throat, quietly dragging him up to the office before throwing him in front of his own panic room to open the vault via retina scan. Hardly a surprise that a security salesman with his history had decent lockdown protocols, with the remnants of his old life in the private military hidden away out of sight. Alongside his spoils of war were the rotating key codes used to open his personal vault, finally allowing the gang access to the hard drive carrying the encryption protocol, locked within a last gasp measure, a classic security safe. With the codes in hand, they snuck over to the office one final time to ensure the drive would be usable and that their search was truly complete, before finally putting a bullet into Laurent, as loose ends had cost them before. It was clear from their subservience to a worm like Mason, who despite years of military experience put up no fight whatsoever, that the other men in the apartment were no threat to them, so the crew left them to find the bodies themselves. After silently departing the high-rise to bring their bounty back to Joy, with the last piece of the puzzle in hand, she easily ripped into Shark's server, finding terabytes of incriminating evidence of more than just her and Garnet's plot against the gang. Enough bank fraud and corruption to end the careers of a small army of businessmen and politicians. Additionally, she was able to reverse engineer Mason's encryption tech to upgrade the C-stacks, giving them a new secure method of growing their wealth once more. Later that day, Shade leaked the contents of the server to the press, and within hours, Shark's reputation was raked across the coals, whilst Garnet was already knee-deep in litigation from Wixia that left him teetering on bankruptcy once more. The Payday gang had won, and they'd hardly had to get their hands dirty. But in the days that followed, the news revealed that it hadn't been the clean victory they'd initially assumed. Shark was found dead on the streets of New York, reported as a freak accident, a drunken hit and run, and Garnet wound up dead at his own hands, bowing out like poor old Nathan before him. But after all these years, the Payday gang don't believe in coincidences. Someone was tying up loose ends before the inevitable trials took place, and if that someone wasn't one of their own, that meant they still had a problem. If only Mason could still talk, they might have been able to squeeze out of him exactly who it was he was phoning in his final hours. After all, they still don't know what organisation their would-be assassins actually came from. Whoever it was calling the shots was still out there pulling the strings, and based on who was left alive at the end of it all, it seemed the gang had left their most dangerous enemy until last. A huge thank you to my dedicated Patreon backers. If you want to join this crew in going infamous, check out the link below and pledge as little as $2 to see your name in the credits, or get 24-hour early access to future videos and vote on upcoming content. Take care, I'll see you all soon.